Thank you very much, Jamal, for the warm introduction. It's great to be here with Professor Yam and with Don. So for the title for the biography, as Jamal mentioned, is The Most American King, Abdullah of Jordan. And it really discusses the unique relationship that King Abdullah personally has with the United States. So he grew up attending middle school and high school in Massachusetts. He went to Deerfield Academy. And in fact, when his father wanted him to do Arabic lessons, he would often hide in the closet. He was on the wrestling team and he went by the name Ab for a while because he wanted to fit in with one of the guys. Later, he attended Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and so much enjoyed that experience, he ended up sending his own children to the prestigious Jesuit university. He trained with U.S. military officers in Kentucky, and after his Army trainings in the morning and the afternoon, he would go out partying and drinking with his U.S. Military officers, according to one individual who I spoke with. And then afterwards, he went on his honeymoon in Hawaii, Washington, D.C., New York, because he so much enjoyed his American experience. And given the amount of time he spent in the West, by the time he became king in 1999, he actually spoke better English than Arabic. And even to this day, he owns luxury properties in both in Washington, D.C., in Georgetown, and in California. But it's not just a personal relationship that he has with the United States that's unique. It's also the political one. So King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to meet with both President Biden, President Trump, and President Obama in the White House, highlighting the strong ties between Amman and Washington. Thousands of U.S. troops have been deployed in the Hashemite Kingdom under both Democratic and Republican administrations. The cooperation between the CIA and Jordan's intelligence services, the GID, is especially close. And after 9/11, the Bush administration actually sent non-Jordanian prisoners to Jordan because they believed they could be interrogated more freely before sending them afterwards to Guantanamo Bay. Now, during the Arab Spring, unlike President Obama's approach towards Egypt and President Hosni Mubarak when he faced protests, at that time, the U.S. president's policy was that Mubarak needed to go. With Jordan, even though there were significant protests against the Hashemite leader, accusations of corruption, of high unemployment in the country, President Obama did not adopt a similar approach with King Abdullah and did not call him to resign. Later on, during the 2021 sedition affair involving Prince Hamza, once again, President Biden at the time offered very strong support for King Abdullah personally, not just the Hashemite family, not just the Jordanian government, but personally for King Abdullah during a moment of potential peril. So there's a tremendous relationship between the two countries that is quite deep. And then, of course, in recent years, the U.S. has provided Jordan with almost $1.5 billion in annual U.S. aid. Now, some say that under the current administration, President Trump recently made a visit to Qatar, recently made a visit to Saudi Arabia. So therefore, Jordan's ties with President Trump are not unique in that regards. But I would show that in this book demonstrates that the relationship between King Abdullah and the United States is not just with a single president or not just with a single party. It's been bipartisan over decades. So if you look at Qatar, for example, now the relations at one point were strong. But if you remember in 2017, President Trump called for an embargo against Qatar because he said the country supported terrorism, and there was a lot of tensions between the two countries at the time. And of course, Saudi Arabia, the relations are warm, but under the previous administration with Democrats, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was viewed as a pariah, according to President Biden. So Jordan under King Abdullah is unique, and therefore why I thought the title, The Most American King, Abdullah of Jordan, was appropriate. Now, those very strong relations that King Abdullah has with Washington has come with a cost, at least according to the Jordanian public opinion. So there have been a series of decisions that King Abdullah has made that Washington appreciated, that many Jordanians opposed. So if you look at during the Obama administration, King Abdullah, under pressure from Secretary Clinton and President Obama, agreed to the largest ever gas accord between the two countries, a multi-billion-dollar agreement about 10 years ago. At the same time, Jordanians widely opposed that agreement, and the accord is still denounced even to this day. If you go back about 20 years during the Second Iraq War in 2003, King Abdullah had a different approach than his father, King Hussein. King Hussein strongly denounced the United States at the time, and that led to actually a reduction of U.S. aid to Jordan in the early 1990s. But King Abdullah managed to work quietly with the Bush administration, allowing U.S. troops to be deployed in the country, allowed for overflight rights from Jordan into Iraq, and along with intelligence gathering missions from Jordan into Iraq that allowed for a much more productive relationship with the United States at the time. But many Jordanians thought that it was inappropriate for Jordan to be partnering with the United States during the invasion of a fellow Arab state. And then finally, in recent years, 2024 and 2025, we have Iran firing missiles over Jordanian airspace fired at Israel on 3 separate occasions. And Jordan's military actually shot these missiles down. Not only did it themselves, but also allowed U.S. troops in the country to shoot them as well. And certainly some Jordanians were opposed to that measure. They said, why are we getting involved in the attacking of Israel, especially when so many Palestinians were being killed in Gaza? So time and time again, King Abdullah has chosen to align himself with Washington, even though some of the public disagrees with him. And then finally, another key theme of the book is how King Abdullah has often promised to advance his country to the path of democratization, human rights, but on the ground, there's been actually very little change. So he promised in 2013, actually during an interview with The Atlantic magazine, that under his son's rule, Jordan would be a democracy similar to the United Kingdom. He said during the Arab Spring, he promised that Parliament would be choosing the prime minister, not the king, which would have been a change in policy. And he's also promised time and time again, whether in an op-ed with the Wall Street Journal or in other publications with the West, that he would move Jordan towards a democracy. But we see while Jordan is certainly have better human rights treatment than neighboring Syria under President Bashar al-Assad or Saddam Hussein in Iraq, it's far from a democracy. So for example, The Economist ranks countries' democratic levels and put Jordan at the lowest ranking in authoritarian in its most recent index. In the past few months, the Jordanian authorities has banned the Muslim Brotherhood, the largest opposition party, even though the Muslim Brotherhood, its political action front, the Islamic Action Front, its political party, won the largest number of seats in the 2024 election. Now the party is banned, and Jordanian authorities have accused the Muslim Brotherhood of engaging in terrorism. And finally, even though King Abdullah promised that Parliament would be the one selecting the prime minister, that in fact was never implemented, and the king continues to select the prime minister. And in fact, sometimes he selects the prime ministers even before the elections, which makes one wonder what's the purpose of the elections if the prime minister is already chosen. And then we should also note that in 2023, King Abdullah ratified a cyber crime law, which activists in the country have accused Jordanian authorities of stifling free speech. And also we should note that the king continues to appoint every single member of the Senate, which is key to passing legislation because it has to go both from the lower house and the upper house. So those are some of the key themes of the book, both his very strong relationship with the United States and how that the tensions have arose with some of its people because of that, but also the promises on democracy and human rights and how that has not really been implemented.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much. Thank you for your comprehensive and condensed presentation. Just before giving the floor to Dr. Sean Yom, allow me to begin with a question to you. And let's start with what we can call it box anecdote or story. What really motivated you to write this book? And what is a special event or particular idea or a turning point in your research and covering Jordan that pushed you to write such a book?
Sure. So I've been interested in Jordan for many years. I used to be a reporter in Amman in 2015 and 2016. And even when I went back to the United States, I continued returning to the country, writing articles, speaking with Jordanians, I have a podcast as well on Jordanian politics on Jordan where we discuss many of these issues. But when I started researching for this book in 2022, I noticed that King Abdullah had been in power for over 20 years at the time, and there hadn't been a single comprehensive biography written about him. So there was a significant gap in the literature. Often what was written about Jordan would be, 80% of the book would be about King Hussein, and then at the end there would be a few pages about King Abdullah. There have been many important books that have gone in that similar style. And I thought that if we think about in the United States, where how many books have been written about President Biden, President Trump, it's just an endless number. But Jordan, even though King Abdullah has played such a critical role both within the country and the unique relationship with the United States, I thought there surely needs to be a book that solely focuses on him, not King Hussein, because a tremendous amount has already been written about King Hussein. And both focusing on his personal life, which is very intriguing because of the relationship he has both with the United States, but he also actually served in the British military, which is unique for an Arab leader. But also King Abdullah's policy, both in domestic concerns, in terms of the Arab Spring, the Hamza affair, his management of the economy and the political reform issues, but also foreign policy, his relationship with Syria, Iraq, the United States, etc. So I wanted to fill this gap, and that's what motivated me with this book.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks. Dr. Shonyom, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jamal. So as the other panelists here today, very honored to be here with Aaron and with Jamal, and those of you in the audience. I think the community of people who study, know, research, engage, travel to, and otherwise interrogate the politics of Jordan is far too small. It should be larger because I think we can all agree Jordan is among the most open of the Arab countries. It's also one of the most poorly understood. And so therefore, I think very timely interrogations and reflections upon the Jordanian leadership, which Aaron's book delivers in spades, and contemporary analyses like these go a long way in filling that gap of neglect or ignorance and helping us ascertain not just the present circumstances of the Hashemite kingdom, but also project the future as to what Jordan might look like 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years from now. One of the things that always struck me as interesting about Jordan is that it's a contrived country, but it's also a country that celebrates its benchmarks, right? So Jordan's centennial was in 2021. It was in the middle of COVID. And amidst all the royal celebrations around the country, it just felt like, and maybe some of your experiences converge with mine, but that many Jordanians that I knew, for instance, just kind of collectively shrugged their shoulders and said, well, we're still here. Jordan is still surviving, and we still have a monarchy, and we're still here. And I guess that's an achievement. And when I heard that, it troubled me because I thought, well, obviously when you're in a bad neighborhood geopolitically and your neighbors are Israel, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, then yes, perhaps merely surviving is a metric of success. But anything can look good when the rest of your neighbors are really bad. And I thought that what are the long-term goals of Jordan beyond merely surviving? Because if another 100 years pass and the Jordanian government says, well, we did it, we survived another 100 years, well, surviving is one thing, but surviving is not thriving. That's not the same thing as achieving a long-term goal. So this would be the first question that I would pose to you, Aaron, in terms of synthesizing your very meticulous biography of King Abdullah and contextualizing his life and interweaving it kind of within the political developments of the Jordanian state writ large. My question would be, given the profile of the leader as you portray, right? This is clearly an individual with very strong personal, professional, and strategic ties to the United States. And under his tenure, Jordan has uncontroversially, because I think this is public knowledge, become a very close ally of America. We political scientists would call Jordan effectively a client state of American hegemony in terms of the degree of economic or military assistance. Given that this has happened under a ruler who by now and this tells you about all the change happening in the Middle East over the last generation, a ruler who is now the longest tenured national head of state in the entire Arab world, right? He's outlasted them all, partly because the Arab Spring knocked out all of his older competitors like Mubarak and then Ali and so forth. Given this, what does the next, my question is, what does the next 10 years of Jordanian politics look like from the perspective of, let's take the issue of democracy and democratization? Because this is something that I know we've all looked at and reflected upon very critically over the past decade or two. This stop and start cycle of democratic reforms and shallow liberalization that seems to have so much ebullient hope when at the start of a process, a reform process, but then loses steam until another committee meets and reformulates a new reform strategy, and then that goes on until it loses steam. This stop and start cycle of democratic reform, as you describe in your book, is part and parcel kind of a reflection of the U.S.-Jordanian relationship. The U.S. morally would like Jordan to liberalize, but the U.S. doesn't punish the Jordanian leadership when it backtracks from its democratic reforms. Given what we know, King Abdullah is now a veteran Arab leader, right? He's been in power for more than a quarter century. And given that Jordan is such a close ally of the United States, and given what we know about U.S. foreign policy, my question is, Aaron, do you think that any dramatic democratic change is possible in Jordan over the next 10 years, given the current state of U.S.-Jordanian relations and given what we know about the Jordanian leadership?
Sure, it's a great question, and I'm not overly optimistic that we're going to see a significant change, certainly on the democratic front in Jordan in the next, whether a few years or even 10 years. As you mentioned, one of the key drivers for democratic change in Jordan has often been external pressure, specifically from the United States. And we saw that during the Bush administration, which led to Moran Mosher's push for democracy in 2005, and then along with the Arab Spring in 2011, where we had not significant pressure from the United States and President Obama, but some. But now with President Trump, that just does not seem to be a priority from the United States at all. In terms of the U.S.-Jordanian relationship, the focus is on economic agreements, security ties, cooperation against terrorism, maybe Jordan's relationship and the Israeli-Palestinian question. But President Trump is not focusing on democratization in the Arab world at large or in Jordan specifically. So I think it's unlikely to be from that front. And then, if anything, we've seen a regression in terms of democratic norms in Jordan in the past year, most significantly with the crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood after the Islamic Action Front did so well during the recent election. So there doesn't seem to be any motivation for Jordanian authorities to be liberalizing. If anything, it's cracking down more. And especially as Jordan moves to transfer power from the king to his son, the Crown Prince Hussein, it seems to be the priority for the Crown Prince to make sure he enters into power in a very strong fashion, not kind of balancing between him and the voice of the people or Islamists within the country. And I think, if anything, King Abdullah tried to answer your question, Professor Yam, in the beginning of his term, when he said, we're going to try to make Jordan not just existing, but thriving. And we can see a few examples of that. I would say, number one, with his focus on the economy. King Abdullah came into power with very high unemployment. It was about 25% in 1999. And he said, we're going to be shifting tracks on the economy. We're going to be doing more of a privatization that's going to increase jobs. It's going to lower debt. And there was actually some success for that. He actually nearly divided the unemployment in half. By 2008, it was about 13%. So there was some success in that. But unfortunately, since the Great Recession in 2008, and then we hit the Arab Spring in 2011, this Syrian refugee crisis, ISIS, Jordan's economy has been actually terrible. And the unemployment rate right now is about 22%. And that's not just a COVID factor. It's been going on for very long. So King Abdullah, while I assume he personally would like for the economy to be better, because that would reduce the resentment some activists have towards his continued rule, he's just been unable to do that. And then in terms of the identity of the country, King Abdullah, when he came into power in the first few years, even before President Trump, he actually pushed what we call a Jordan first policy. And there were banners across the country trying to say we need to prioritize our own national interests over pan-Arab issues, whether that was opposition to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 that many Jordanians felt, or in solidarity with the Palestinians during the Second Intifada. And King Abdullah said, no, we need to separate ourselves and we need to have a unique Jordanian identity, and that'll help us thrive. But as we see today, so many Jordanians are increasingly aligned with the Palestinian suffering in Gaza, and there is more and more pressure from the street for King Abdullah to adopt a different approach on the Palestinian issue and Israel, and to align himself more closely with the Palestinians and not differentiate himself. So it'll be interesting when his son, the Crown Prince, takes power. It's not exactly clear whether that's going to be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or longer, but whether he's going to try to differentiate himself to bring, whether that's both the economic success, the political liberalization, or the identity, because that could be a shift that, unfortunately for King Abdullah's sake, after 25 years, he's been unable to bring for Jordan.
I think, Jamal, before I turn this back to you, because I know you have a bevy of questions of your own, I think a good provocative way to kind of frame these future projections would be the following. Again, combining the two core elements of your excellent book, just King Abdullah as a person and ruler and head of state, and the context of the U.S.-Jordanian relationship. So a more provocative way to frame the question is, given that this particular leader is who he is on the basis, like all of us, on the basis of past experiences, personal upbringing, and his own political and moral intentionality. So given that that's a fixed variable, and it's a fixed parameter, it's not a variable, given that, as you point out, and we all know, that the U.S. has very profoundly important strategic interests with Jordanian stability, whether it comes with safeguarding Israel, containing Iran, watching ISIS, Syrian drug smuggling, maintaining military kind of predominance over the Levant, and being able to have a military bridge to the Gulf. All these issues are so important for the United States in terms of maintaining a stable and moderate Jordan. So the provocative question is this: given that those two things are not likely going to change, is there anything that could change in the not next year, like next decade? So let's take us to 2035, that could move the needle of democracy in Jordan. So if we can't change leadership, and we can't change the structural givens of the U.S.-Jordanian relationship, is there any possibility for democratic change? Is there some other variable that can get us there? Or are these two constraints, these parameters, are they basically it?
Sure, it's a great question. I would say there are some factors that could arise that would shift the current situation off its current trajectory. I would say, number one, if there were this large protest movement in Jordan, specifically focusing on political issues, not economic issues, perhaps maybe together, which would be more likely, that could shift the conversation away from the status quo of security issues and focusing on regional matters and more towards liberalization. The protests do happen in Jordan. It's not just about the Arab Spring. There have been large protests we saw in 2018 over the IMF reforms. We saw in 2000 in the past few years over the high gas prices. So protests do happen, but it would have to be sustained, not just over days or weeks, but it would have to be like months, maybe even like the Arab Spring, which went on for over a year. That could push the trajectory and kind of force the attention of the king that he needs to shift policies. Protests are always possible, though I would not say that in the short term it's incredibly likely that such a sustained protest movement could happen. And so that would be number one. Number two is if there's a dramatic shift in the Palestinian question, that could shift attention from the regime and alter even the political echelon. So, for example, the red line that the Jordanian regime has said over and over again, if there's a large-scale transfer of Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan forcibly by Israel during the war, not specifically what happens to Palestinians, not the death toll in Gaza, not the suffering, but if there's a dramatic demographic change, that could shift the conversation because Jordan already has about 50 to 60% of individuals of Palestinian origin. It's the largest number of Palestinians on a percentage basis in the Arab world outside of certainly the West Bank and Gaza. So that could shift it as well. Though I would say at the time, it doesn't seem that is anything is theoretically possible. It doesn't seem to be that is the number one priority right now of the Netanyahu government in terms of the Palestinian population. It seems to be more focused on the Palestinians in Gaza. So I would say those are two factors. And then finally, if we have a change in power in the United States in 2028, and we have, I don't know, a figure like Bernie Sanders or someone like Bernie Sanders who really prioritizes democracy. But even if that were to happen, I don't imagine that Jordan would be the top priority of this Democratic candidate for political reform because there are, and this is to Jordan's benefit, there are a lot of human rights issues across the country, and Jordan is certainly not the most egregious one, whether it's the war in Russia and Ukraine, everything that's going on with Gaza. So Jordan might face some pressure in that situation, but it doesn't seem to be in an overwhelming fashion.
Got it. So I think we have a roadmap for the next 10 years. That's not a particularly sunny one.
I'm not sure whether يعني we are talking about the internal factor in the democratization process. It's been let me call it exhaustively or comprehensively discussed. I'm still thinking that democratization without يعني vivid and effective internal factor, it's unlikely, by one way or another. By the way, just two questions or 2 points, not questions. If you can elaborate on, I would appreciate. One of them is about the recent attitude from the Israeli government towards Jordan, which is they start talking harshly about Jordan. Is it يعني, to the king or to the people? For instance, they recently threatened to stop the gas supply and the water supply also, in addition to some يعني, hidden messages. Is it for Jordanians or for the regime? This is one. Second, it's about the future of Syria. To what extent this could tilt the balance of the international community towards all of excuses of not to democratize Jordan by one way or another. If this regime whose Al-Qaeda origin became accepted and qualified according to the international standards and to the Syrian standards, do you think this would provide a precedent or a precedent for the Jordanians to stop saying that democracy is tough because Islamists will ascend to power? These 2 points,
Yeah.
just in my mind, and hopefully in the discussion we will discuss more.
Sure. So those are great questions, especially the second one, I think, is particularly intriguing. I'll start with the first one in terms of the recent tensions between Israel and Jordan as the Gaza war extends. I would say King Abdullah has been operating a very delicate balancing act towards Israel and the war in Gaza since the beginning of the conflict arose in October 2023. So he decided to pull the Jordanian ambassador from Tel Aviv. He told the Israeli ambassador in Amman not to return. And he also froze a water for energy deal that was pushed for by the UAE. But at the same time, he has continued with the security cooperation between the two countries. In fact, Axios reported that Syria was a mediator between Syria and HTS with Israel. So Jordan has played that key role. And then finally, of course, in response to the Jordanian protests, he has not canceled the 1994 peace treaty and has kept the multi-billion-dollar gas deal. So he's trying to be both sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause, because I think nobody in Jordan is happy with the high Palestinian death toll in Gaza, but he realizes he would not be able to continue to receive the nearly $1.5 billion in annual U.S. aid if he were to cut the 1994 peace treaty and engage in hostilities with Israel. So that's been his policy towards Israel. And in terms of the Israeli threats towards Jordan, there have been some comments. We had a Likud minister saying that part of Jordanian territory is part of Greater Israel, and we had Netanyahu emphasize Greater Israel, though Netanyahu didn't explicitly say Jordan in his comments. We've had some threats, as you mentioned, about the water and the gas deal, but I don't think Jordan is the top priority for Israel right now, and I don't think it wants to open up another battlefield. After all, Jordan's border is the longest one Israel has. And Jordan has played, from Israel's perspective, a very helpful role in the war. One example would be the shooting down of Iranian missiles, but the other is the crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood and arresting Palestinian militants who are trying to smuggle weapons and drugs from Syria into Jordan, into the West Bank. So having kind of chaos on Israel's eastern front with Jordan, I don't think would be in the country's national interest. And I think how we see an example is in contrast to Israel's almost on a daily basis criticism of Spain and the Spanish leaders for their statements. Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't personally criticized King Abdullah, and the Israeli government generally is more careful about him specifically because they know Jordan has a very strategic relationship with them, and it's not in their interest to do so, unlike, for example, Erdogan or Spain. There has been a little bit of a differentiation with King Abdullah. Now, with Syria, I agree that your argument is quite compelling because we saw during the Arab Spring, especially in that 2013, the famous article in Atlantic magazine where King Abdullah did the interview, where he said his concern is about the Muslim Brotherhood taking power and he doesn't want that. And we see in Syria, now that Assad has fallen, King Abdullah has not only managed to work with the new Syrian administration along with the rest of the international community, but the relationship is quite strong between Jordan and Syria right now, and I would argue much better than during the Assad days. So I do think it's going to make it more complicated for him to make that argument going forward, that if we have Islamists come into power, therefore it's going to be terrible and we should prevent it at all costs. But I think what differentiates the situation between Jordan and Syria is that there was an armed opposition movement that was Islamist that took control with very little support from the West in recent years. And they did it almost independently. They had some support from Turkey, but in general, this was not a US-led operation. We don't see the current dynamics in Jordan where the US is funneling weapons to the Jordanian Islamist opposition against King Abdullah. It just seems very unlikely. So it would have to be that the Islamists would have to take control over Jordan by themselves, topple King Abdullah, even though King Abdullah has the support of the GID, the intelligence services, the military, and all of the Western support. If in that case, then the Islamists might win, some respect from the United States, but in general, they would have to do it by themselves first, and there are a lot of difficulties for them to do it. So I'm not particularly optimistic that the Syria example would apply to what's happening in Jordan right now.
Thank you, Aaron. Just before going to, I do have two questions. Before going to these two questions, Dr. Shonyom, do you have any following up issues or points?
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to underscore the Israeli factor as perhaps, this would just be my personal academic opinion, perhaps the biggest unknown I think that Jordanian foreign policy faces. And this is why I'm particularly interested, Aaron, in hearing your views about how you think King Abdullah might deal with this. Because in the past, even before the 94 peace treaty, the nature of covert Israeli-Jordanian relations were predicated upon the idea that of all the Arab evils, Jordan was the lesser Arab evil for the Israeli state. Now, not only did that kind of relationship have the backing of the United States, which helped facilitate decades later the 94 peace treaty, but it also benefited from the fact that while you did have political alternation in Tel Aviv with the Israeli government, in general, labor and left-leaning Israeli governments tended to prove easier to deal with than right-leaning Israeli governments. I think what's happening now, as you know, many Middle East analysts have seen over the last, not really the last 15 years, but especially since October 2023, is the absolute hegemonic predominance of not just a right-wing government in Israel, but a right-wing government shot through with an especially toxic millennialist interpretation of Zionism that gives a lot less credence to the traditional strategic value of a stable Jordan or even a stable Egypt. And I think some resonances of that came out early on before the ongoing Gaza invasion and slaughter. Last year, you heard proposals, or last spring, you heard proposals backed by Trump in his first 30 to 50 days in office about taking over Gaza, relocating the Gazans to Jordan and Egypt without caring about the impact they would have on those countries, turning Gaza into a touristic mega wonderland and allowing Israel to turn its sights upon the West Bank. Now, while those plans mercifully seem to have been shelved, what I worry about is the continued ascent of extremely right-wing millennialist voices in the Israeli state, primarily among a certain cluster of parties who insist that either Jordan will inevitably accept the forced ethnic cleansing of Palestine and accept not just Gazans, but West Banker Palestinians too, once Israel annexes the West Bank, which they see as an inevitability, right? And many of us don't, but they see this as an inevitability, number one. Or number two, you occasionally get those really far out there. They used to be fringe, but now they're scarily increasingly mainstream articulations of a greater Israel vision, where Israel now overlaps with the East Bank. And now you wonder, now it's not a matter of where the Palestinians will go, where will the Transjordanians and East Bankers go? So given that it seems that the current right-wing strain of Israeli government doesn't seem to care all that much about having a stable Jordan on its eastern flank, because the idea is that whatever consequences come, they can deal with this later. Given also we're dealing with an Israeli government that doesn't seem to care about multiple repeated violations of other Arab states' sovereignty, Tunisia, Yemen, Qatar, Syria, etc. I mean, this is a country that was embarrassed when it failed to assassinate Khaled Mishal in Jordan in 1997, the Hamas official. Now, within the course of 30 days, it's launched operations in 4 or 5 different Arab countries. Given all of that, again, this is a very difficult question, but this is why it's nice to be the interlocutor, not the author. What is Jordan under King Abdullah supposed to do? Right? Because you put it best. They can't abrogate the peace treaty with Israel. That will cut off U.S. aid. And they can't freeze ties with America. Then there goes the 4,000 troops in Zarqa Air Base and all the other American assets and infrastructure in Jordan, as well as the U.S.-built border security wall with on the Jordanian, Syrian, Iraqi frontiers. So Jordan can't touch the 94 peace treaty, but as you point out, there are popular uprisings and protests against what is clearly, I think, by my personal interpretation, a genocidal operation in Gaza. And so you have a leadership that has, as you put it, maintained an equipoise or balance so far, but now it's reached this unenviable place where it's being squeezed by Israel that's no longer amenable to compromise, and it can't turn its back on America. But virtually everyone in Jordanian society doesn't like what's going on. And it seems like the only option is the status quo. Now, in the old days, the status quo was, okay, just keep your head strong, lay low, and eventually you'll get out of this. But again, speaking for just myself and maybe a few other analysts, given the trajectory of the Israeli government and its expansionism, does the status quo still carry room for for the existence of a Jordan? So again, so basically, under King Abdullah, as you understand him, Aaron, and given the current constraints of the U.S.-Jordanian relationship, what is Jordan like? What should Jordan be doing like right now to alleviate the incredible pressures that's facing, given just what is, by all accounts, an existential threat?
Sure. So it's a good question, and without a doubt, King Abdullah has difficulties in the current status quo. He's quite weak in terms of his ability to influence the Netanyahu government, which is almost non-existent. He's called for the end of the war in Gaza since 2023, and Netanyahu certainly hasn't listened to him, nor has he listened to many other leaders, both in the region and internationally. But his influence in the White House is not the same as it was during the Biden administration. So President Trump will certainly meet with King Abdullah. He appreciates his perspective. He praised him in a very almost comical way at the end of the February 2025 visit. But it's not like King Abdullah is his number one person he's calling at midnight from Mar-a-Lago. But I would say what King Abdullah is trying to do is maintain strong relations with other key countries that do have influence over Israel. And I would say a good example would be the UAE. Jordan has especially a strong relationship with the UAE. And when the UAE issued that ultimatum it was a few weeks ago about annexation of the West Bank, that I think did scare the Netanyahu government, at least momentarily. We can't say whether it's going to be permanently, but that did halt, at least for the time being, the talks that Israel was going to annex the West Bank, which for Jordan would be a big problem. So I think what King Abdullah is trying to do is leverage his relationship with both countries like the UAE, but also I think key elements within the U.S. security establishment, whether it's CENTCOM, whether it's the CIA, King Abdullah, or whether it's members of Congress on both Democratic and Republican sides. King Abdullah, when he comes to Washington on a very regular basis, he's always putting in the legwork to meet with some people who might be below head of state in other countries, but he's still meeting with the members of the Armed Services Committee, CENTCOM leaders, CIA officials, in order to present his case. Then they kind of convince President Trump that at least Jordanian territory is a red line. And while there are certainly calls within some members of the Israeli government to have an expansionist view even into Jordan, which would certainly be shocking, and that would definitely tear apart the 1994 agreement. I don't think that's going to be within the short term what we're going to be seeing, just because there's so much pressure right now in Gaza, and now we have this new operation in Gaza City, and that's quite controversial both in Israel, but certainly in the West and in the Arab world as well. I think what King Abdullah is just going to try to do is just strengthen his relationship with key actors, whether it's regional or international, and hope that deters the Israeli government, because he doesn't really have many other options. He can't fight a war with Israel, because he would lose pretty badly. That's what happened in 1967. And there had been talk in recent weeks with the mobilization efforts that Jordan is doing with its military service, that this is now going to be targeted against Israel. But people know who study Jordan seriously that the chances of Jordan, launching a strike against Israel militarily are quite low. So the only options he has are diplomatic, and I think he plays those cards as well as an Arab leader can.
Thank you.
Jamal, can I just ask a quick follow-up?
Yes, absolutely.
Very provocative counterfactual that up until last week would have been ludicrous, but now I guess my mind is racing into a very uncertain future, and I feel like this has become a bit more reasonable kind of hypothetical scenario. What if Israel launches a unilateral strike against a target in Jordan, justified under the premise that it was a Hamas asset, right? Like, of course, we pray it doesn't, and we think that it won't, but that was our assumption with Qatar, right? Until a week or two ago. Let's say there is some secret Muslim Brotherhood cell in Jordan that is harboring some secret Hamas leader that the Israeli intelligence knows about somehow, and they choose to go about this unilaterally, putatively, like last time, without letting the US know, and they pull it off. Do you think in that hypothetical scenario that changes the game in terms of giving Abdullah more options? Or do you think that's just never going to happen because Jordan occupies one rung higher for Israel than Qatar does?
So I definitely agree with you that anything is possible, and it's not even a scenario that we could never imagine because it actually has happened not just with Israel but under Netanyahu. And as you mentioned, in 1997, when Israel did exactly that, when it tried to assassinate Hamas official Khalid Mashal in Jordan. So
Yeah.
it's certainly possible. I agree with you, it's not likely, at least right now, because as you mentioned, Jordan is perceived as strategically more important for Israel than a country like Qatar. But if that were to happen, I do agree that that would give him some leverage, because then at that point, I think he could threaten to cancel the agreement, which King Hussein did in the late 1990s. And when he did that, that caused the United States to intervene. And then there was pressure on Israel, and then that caused Israel to release a very prominent Hamas leader at the time. And then there were some changes in the relationship on some level because of that attack. So I think that would give him some leverage. But I just don't think that if it were a one-time attack, that would lead to Jordan fundamentally ending the peace treaty and starting, sort of military operations between the two countries. Just because once it goes back to the same questions we've talked about, the amount of aid that Jordan gets from the United States, the military, and the economic and the intelligence connections. Jordan doesn't really have another option besides the United States. Actually, earlier this year, when there was talk about the United States freezing aid to every country in the world, not just Jordan, some were saying maybe Jordan could go towards China or Russia to replace the United States. But those aren't really options because Russia is so preoccupied with Ukraine. It doesn't have $1.5 billion every single year to be giving Jordan. I mean, there's just not an option. And China, for example, has provided some money to Jordan, but it's often been loans where they want the money back after the project and with interest. So for Jordan, given its budgetary woes, those aren't possibilities. And for countries like Russia and China, Jordan is just not a strategic country for them. It's nice to be friends with King Abdullah, but they're not going to be providing $1.5 billion every single year in advanced military weaponry for the small desert country with an unemployment rate of over 20% in oil. So King Abdullah, under his philosophy, is really going to prioritize, as he's done because of the personal relationship, but also for his political ideology, his strategic ties with the United States. Now, it could be different under his son, Crown Prince Hussein. It's always possible. King Abdullah did change certain policies from his father, so we could see Crown Prince Hussein doing that as well. But at the same time, we have to remember that Crown Prince Hussein also has a lot of strong connections with the United States. He also went to Georgetown University. He met his wife, who studied at Syracuse University in New York. So he has very strong relationship with the United States. Of course, he speaks fluent English, not Russian or Chinese. So it is possible that we could see a change. But I think for the time being, the status quo happens in Jordan for many years, and it'd be dangerous to bet against it.
Yeah. And the Crown Prince is in the US, I think,
Thank-
soon, right? On a working visit. I think he left Jordan today, the Crown Prince.
Yeah.
Maybe in
And King
Yeah,
Abdullah
he's-
actually left for another visit to New
Yeah,
York.
thank you for both of you. And I would like really to apologize from the attendant, our guests who raised some questions. We don't have time, just if you have a couple of words in 30 seconds, 40 seconds, Aaron.
Well, I just wanted to thank Professor Yam for his excellent questions. Thank you, Jamal, as well. You wrote a very interesting review. It's on the Dawn website today of the book, so I really appreciate that. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. If people have questions for me, I'm happy to answer them via email or via Twitter. So thank you.
I will forward the questions to you so we can find a way. Thank you, Dr. Sean. Do you have any 30 seconds notes?
No, I just have a 10-second note. It was a pleasure to be here. I love the book. I'm happy. We have so many participants who are interested and engaged in Jordanian affairs, and hope that the community of Jordanian-minded scholars and interlocutors only continues to grow. It remains an important but understudied country.
Thank you, both of you. really it was a source of pleasure, and waiting for Dr. Yom's new book. So hopefully we will discuss it sometimes in this year.